As a longstanding board member at FTD, I take great pride and, frankly, am continually amazed at the effectiveness of this tiny organization as a participant in the war of ideas on behalf of liberal democracy, and more importantly, in shaping policy and its enactment here in DC and in Europe and other countries. Although there's no pleasure in contemplating the subject matter of the panel this morning, I do have the honor of introducing a distinguished set of panelists who will be discussing Iran's grievous human rights record. These panelists have unique insights into the Iranian regime, its harsh treatment of domestic political opponents, and its activities to stifle dissent both in and outside of Iran. First, Marina Nemat was born in Tehran, where at age 16 she learned the brutality of Iran's revolutionary leaders, who imprisoned her and tortured her for criticizing the government. After being forced to convert to Islam and marry against her will, Ms. Nemat fled to Canada, where she lives to this day and teaches at the University of Toronto. She wrote her life story in the book Prisoner of Tehran and is the recipient of the European Parliament's First Human Dignity Prize in 2007. Ali Alfoneh is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he specializes on Iran and the role of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in its domestic politics. Mr. Alfoneh served previously as a research fellow at the Institute for Strategy at the Royal Danish Defense College. Emanuele Ottolenghi is a senior fellow here at FTD, where he also specializes in Iran, and for which he wrote his book, The Pasaran, Inside Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And finally, Takeyh is a senior fellow at the Council for Foreign Relations. Born in Tehran, Mr. Takeyh earned his doctorate at Oxford University and later served as an advisor to U.S.-Iran point man Dennis Ross under President Obama. The session will be moderated by Mark Landler, a White House correspondent for the New York Times. He's reported for the Times from 67 countries on 6 continents, from Germany to Hong Kong, Afghanistan to Yemen. In 2007, he won an Overseas Press Club Award. We thank these distinguished experts for joining us today and hope you're going to enjoy the exchange. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to FTD's Washington Forum.
Good morning. It's a very interesting panel, so I want to get quickly into questions. But just to very quickly set the stage, I don't need to tell anyone who's in this room about the depth of the problem of human rights abuses in Iran. I would just read very briefly from the report that the UN Special Rapporteur for Iran filed to the UN General Assembly in September 2011, when the rapporteur highlighted, quote, a pattern of systemic violations of human rights. Iran has refused access to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights for several years now, and in September of 2011, the UN Secretary General submitted a report to the General Assembly in which he said he was, quote, deeply troubled by reports of increased numbers of executions, amputations, arbitrary arrest and detention, unfair trials, torture, and ill treatment, and bemoaned, quote, the crackdown on human rights activists, lawyers, journalists, and opposition activists. And then just to draw one brief example from the week's news, there was actually, I guess, what qualifies in Iran for a slight bit of good news. A well-known human rights lawyer ended her 49-day hunger strike on December 4th. Her name is Nasreen Sotoudeh. She has been imprisoned since 2010, and the regime had imposed a travel ban on her husband and her 12-year-old daughter. So she was on a hunger strike for 49 days and has actually stopped the hunger strike amid an indication that the regime is going to lift that travel ban. So the victories are small and hard won, and the news is relentlessly negative. But it comes at an interesting moment, both for Iran, which has parliamentary elections next June, typically during periods of time when there is that democratic process, as the previous panel alluded to, there's even greater pressure and international scrutiny on Iran's human rights record, and perhaps a temptation by the regime to be even more repressive. And likewise, the Obama administration, with the president's reelection, faces an interesting set of questions about how best to continue on the strategy of trying to prevent the Iranian nuclear program from arriving at the point where they're actually able to produce a weapon, and how you tie an anti-proliferation policy with a human rights policy is an issue that has often been difficult for policymakers to reconcile. So why don't I quickly just open it up? Maybe I'll start with Marina, since your experience of this is so personal, and maybe ask you just on a very basic level whether you think life for ordinary Iranians has gotten better or worse in the last few years, and just give us a kind of your best sense of what the human rights landscape looks like today versus, say, 5 years ago or a decade ago.
Well, I guess this all depends on how much people know here about how bad the absolute disregard for human rights in Iran is in general. I don't know how much you know actually about it. In 1979, when the revolution succeeded, we had hope. Just any other revolution that promises freedom and democracy, we had hope that Iran would actually become a democracy, but that was not the case. My dad was a ballroom dancing instructor in Iran. I'm actually a Christian from Iran. And dancing became illegal, singing became illegal, holding your boyfriend's hand in public became illegal. And in school now we had to cover our hair and cover ourselves. I had grown up wearing the miniskirt and tight t-shirts, and I had been dancing on the beach wearing a bikini, and all of this became illegal. So in classroom, instead of maths and sciences and literature and geography, these are the early days in 1980. Our subjects were replaced by government propaganda. Now, I had grown up reading Jane Austen and Ernest Hemingway and Persian poetry, and now I had to face propaganda 8 hours a day. And I was 14 years old. What do you think, honestly, if having fun becomes illegal? What do you think the average teenager, now, how political can a 14-year-old get? But you ban fun, and the 14-year-old becomes political because they want to sing and dance and just be free and have a good time. That was the basis of all the protests that began in Iran as early as 1980. Now, the Sharia law came into place in Iran very early after the revolution. And under Sharia law, democracy and the freedom of the citizen is impossible. Now, the same set of Sharia laws that governed Iran in 1979 and 1980 are still in place. Now, there have been some cosmetic changes here and there, depending on what administration you have under the presidential. When Mohammad Khatami was the president of Iran, yes, things got a little bit better. So if you wore nail polish, you could get away with it. But does that really make a big difference? Does that mean that Iran becomes free and democratic under the reign of Khatami or people like him? No, because the same set of laws would still govern Iran. Under this constitution, freedom and democracy in Iran is impossible. Now, I'm sure you all know about the American hostages. Everybody knows about the American hostages. The movie Argo just recently came out. But just after those hostages were released, I was in prison in Iran. And at the time, Mr. Mir Hossein Mousavi, who later became the leader of the Green Movement, was the prime minister. Now, I was bound to a bare wooden bed, and they lashed the soles of my feet at the age of 16 with a length of cable. They beat you and beat you and beat you, and then once you're so swollen that your skin is about to burst, then they make you walk. And then when the swelling goes down a little, they beat you again. It's a cycle. Are things any better now for political prisoners in Iran? No, they are not. It's exactly the same, if not worse, if not more systematic. So that is the situation in Iran. When the American hostages were freed, thousands of young Iranians were political prisoners in various Iranian prisons. Did the world hear about them? We were sitting in that prison thinking, oh, this can't be real. I mean, 90% of us were under the age of 20, and we were waiting for the world to say something. And news does come into the prison. But you know what? Nobody said anything. The world didn't care. The world didn't know. I don't know what was wrong with the world, but there was something definitely wrong. And that is why I'm here. I'm here to make sure that the story of Iranian political prisoners, including the ones who are now in prison, is heard and as in known. My heart goes to every single one of them. And by the way, if you're interested in helping them, please come and see me after the talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Marina. Ali, I'd like to ask you, in the last few years, those of us who write about Iranian sanctions policy have heard a lot about the increasing power of the and ubiquity of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and Hillary Clinton a couple of years ago said that Iran was edging closer to being really a military dictatorship. I wonder when Marina talks about this kind of long history of abuse of political prisoners, whether the agents of that abuse have changed over this 20, 30-year span, and whether the increased role of the IRGC has an impact on the human rights landscape. Is the power of the military in Iran actually making matters even worse?
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks to FDD for arranging a panel discussion about human rights. It's rather interesting that in this city, in Washington, D.C., most panels about Iran are about the nuclear program. And there is almost nothing about the human rights problem. This sends a terrible signal to the Iranian audience, to the Iranian public, because it means that you do care about your own security. You do care about the implications of the Islamic Republic becoming a nuclear-armed state. But what happens in Iran does not really matter to the Washington elites. This is the signal Washington has been sending to Iran. And I think that this panel and FDD's initiative to make human rights issue a more important issue on the agenda sends the right signal to the Iranian public, telling them that you do understand that a government which is mistreating its own population can, of course, also not be trusted when it comes to its international relations. And just imagine how it would behave if it is also armed with a nuclear weapon. Concerning your question, sir, about the role of the Revolutionary Guards, yes. The Revolutionary Guards has inherited a religious state, something that was also discussed by the previous panel. When Grand Ayatollah Khomeini was making promises to the Iranian public, to the Iranian people in the 1960s and 70s, he promised the people of Iran not democracy. He promised them justice in this world and salvation in the next. Now, no one has returned from the other world to tell us if they actually achieved salvation. But we know that there is no justice for us in this world. And the system is legitimizing its abuse of the population, its corruption, by reference to the Holy Book. Now, yes, Iranians are mostly Muslim. Huge majority of Iranians are Muslim. But their understanding of Islam is a very different understanding that the government of Iran is imposing on them. And they, for example, do not understand the way that Sharia law was practiced. At the time that you were in prison, and I have to say, Mrs. Nemat, Dr. Nemat was lucky, because at that time we had a prosecutor general of the Revolutionary Tribunal, a gentleman called Hojjatul Islam Khalkhali. Mr. Hojjatul Islam Khalkhali was also called the hanging judge of Tehran. One time he was invited to the city of, to the province of Kurdistan in order to take a look at a group of prisoners who were gathered there. I believe there were 100 Kurds there who had committed some kind of vaguely anti-revolutionary, counter-revolutionary activity. And he, of course, the big judge did not have time to go through all the cases. So he just said, shoot every second of them. And then people asked him, sir, some of these people may be innocent. And the Ayatollah, the Hojjatul Islam, Mr. Khalkhali, he had a sense of humor. He said, well, you see, if they're innocent, they will go to heaven. If they have committed some sin against the revolution, they receive their punishment. This is how the system was working back then in the 1980s. Nowadays, it's a different type of system. You have the Revolutionary Guards officers, which represents a new generation of Iranian leaders. They are replacing the old clerical class. The old clerical class spent its youth at universities, studying theology. The new generation spent its youth at the Iran-Iraq War, trench warfare, just like Iran-Iraq War. Iran-Iraq War and also World War I for the German youth. The German youth coming out of World War I, they were vindictive and they wanted to correct the injustice of the past. For them, correcting injustice of the past was more important than making Germany a better country in the 1930s and 40s. Unfortunately, we see a similar tendency among many of these Revolutionary Guards officers. They no longer have a religious base the same way that the clerics have, but they are using terror in order to control the population. Particularly, they are fond of show trials, Stalinist show trials. We have people who were the rulers of Iran in the 1980s, just like Mr. Mousavi, who today themselves have become prey to the system that they created. They have become prey to the system. They show up at trials and they confess being agents for the CIA, for the Mossad, and for the MI6. Sometimes the Iranian public even wonders how much time they have time during the week, so they can provide services for 3 different huge services. And of course, no one believes that. No one, not a single Iranian believes that these people who served the revolution during the first decade of the revolution have completely become counter-revolutionaries. But the idea is to instigate and instill fear into the hearts of the Iranian public, telling them that somebody like Mr. Mousavi, who was the chosen prime minister of Imam Khomeini, if he is not safe, if he has to appear on show trial, if people who were cabinet ministers in the 1980s have to appear on show trials, then I, as a simple Iranian citizen, I am totally at their mercy. This is the change which has taken place.
Thanks, Ali. Emanuele, I wanted to move on to you and just ask, in light of what Marina said about the indifference that she felt during her period of imprisonment from the West or from the outside world, and given Ali's observation that even having panels on Iran's human rights record is somewhat unusual, somewhat of a novelty in Washington, what does that say about what the West is doing? What measures the West, with the United States, are taking specifically aimed at Iran on its human rights record, as opposed to proliferation or anything else?
First of all, I want to thank my co-panelists and the audience and FTD, of course, for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. It's a pleasure to be here. In the last couple of days, I wanted to look specifically at the kind of policy tools that are present in the basket of Western policy vis-a-vis Iran when it comes to human rights. So I went to the webpage of the European External Action Service because they have a very useful summary page of everything that has to do with human rights with all the countries they have relations with, including Iran. And the one thing that sort of jumped to my eye as the great contribution to human rights on that page was the indication that the European guidelines on human rights on a vast variety of subjects, from women's right to the death penalty to freedom of speech, was also available in Farsi alongside the other 22 languages of the European Union. And it kind of struck me how amazing it is. I'm sure that millions of Iranians are rushing to the website of the European Union to read the guidelines on human rights, which clearly are having a great impact on their lives. One of the problems we're confronting, and it is a real problem, Ali and you clearly both alluded to it, is that we are confronted with a huge dilemma. The dilemma is the following. We want to stop Iran from having nuclear weapons. And there is a widespread belief among policymakers that if you pursue a policy of support for democracy promotion inside Iran at the same time, the regime will move away from negotiations. And if we have to choose between depriving the regime of nuclear weapons or depriving the regime of its power inside the country, it's easier to achieve the former rather than the latter, and it's better overall. That we can live with an authoritarian Iran without nuclear weapon, and we try to pursue a free Iran, we might end up with an inimical, nuclear-armed authoritarian Iran. So it's an understandable dilemma, but it doesn't serve our purposes very well, and we haven't invested significantly on creating human rights tools. So there's a lot of things that we can do to increase our policy basket. And by the way, I think that there is also something expedient and instrumental in increasing it and amplifying the volume of support for human rights, in the sense that if we want to force the regime to make a choice between a nuclear arsenal and survival, the best way to convince them that it's time to negotiate is to tell them, you know, we're going to do everything in our power to bring you down before you achieve nuclear weapons. So I think that there is also an expedient value, but also obviously supporting values which we believe are intrinsic to human nature. After all, we call them human rights because we believe they are intrinsic to what we are. It's not a good thing to be standing for human rights where it's convenient and not supporting them outside the Western world. So there is a long list of reasons why we should be more active. And what we should do? Well, again, there are many things we can do. One thing that I think would work very well vis-a-vis the Iranian public, which is, as it's been said before, no great fan of their own government, is to speak and use the tools of public diplomacy, which we have in our power, a lot more effectively, a lot more insistently to convey the message that we support democratic change inside the country, that we want to see the regime held accountable for human rights. And just to give you one practical example of what we can do, one of the things that is transpiring through the work that I'm conducting and that colleagues are conducting at FTD is that while we're making it extremely difficult oftentimes for real true dissidents to come out of Iran, or once they're out of Iran, to get support from Western governments to become active in the promotion of change inside the country, we're rather lax when it comes to providing visa to members of the regime, former members of the regime, children of members of the regime, who are freely coming to the West to spend time as research fellows at Ivy League universities, who are buying property and investing in our own markets, who are spending time at respectable institutions, who are using our financial systems to enrich themselves. I was recently in London and I was told that the son of a very prominent member of Ahmadinejad's cabinet used the two-tier exchange system that is existing in Iran today to buy pounds, go to London, exchange them back into rials at a more advantageous rate for himself, and then go back to Iran and buy himself a nice apartment in North Iran. These are the things that are happening on a daily basis that are enraging Iranians of all walks of life, that we are allowing out of probably negligence or our underwhelming due diligence when it comes to our immigration policy and who comes in and who goes out. And if we change just that, we would send a powerful signal inside the country.
Ray, you wrestled with these issues in the early days of the Obama administration. And so I wanted to put the same question as Emanuele formulated it to you, which is how does one integrate or reconcile an aggressive policy on human rights with a policy that's very centered on non-proliferation. Is it possible to do that? Emanuele suggests there is a way, and in fact, he used the word expedient. Do you agree with that? I mean, I would note, just by way of setting the stage, that the administration took a fair amount of criticism after the Green Revolution for not speaking up strongly enough, early enough, as that crackdown began there. It is also worth noting that about a year ago, the U.S. announced a set of sanctions on IRGC and other officials on their human rights abuses, which was somewhat different. These sanctions were a little different than the typical sanctions, which are very much aimed at proliferators. This was a set of human rights sanctions. So the administration, I think, would argue that they have tried to grapple with this. But how would you answer that question?
Well, thank you for...
You want to talk on the mic, maybe?
Oh.
Or no, maybe you're okay, I guess.
I hope everybody can
Okay.
hear me. Is that fine? I think when you kind of look at this issue, which is not just strictly a U.S.-Iran issue, but it's embedded in sort of an international structure, the 5+1 structure, that really began to deal with this issue as a proliferation issue in probably about 2005 and 2006. And since then, the Iran issue has been sort of ensconced in a context of international organizations. And the basis of it being in those international organizations is that Iran's violation of its NPT obligations. So the conversation just settles on proliferation. And for all the countries that are dealing with this, the British, the French, the Germans, Russia, China, so on, they all tend to view this as a proliferation problem. So the conversation that is taking place between Iran and the other side tends to be about that issue, very narrowly focused. So to kind of move that conversation, you have to figure out a different kind of architecture to address that. But the 5+1 process as such is designed to deal with the proliferation issue, and the conversation is that it has to do with Iran's violations of the NPT. And there have been about, I think, 6 Security Council resolutions suggest that Iran has to suspend its activities and so forth and so on. But it's a very proliferation-centric issue. There are 2 countries, however, who suggest that the issue between this is not a proliferation issue, but it has to do with the character of the regime. And those 2 countries are, one, Israel, who doesn't view this as a prickly arms control dispute, and the second one is Iran, who similarly suggests that although this is an arms control issue from the perspective of the West, but they're really using arms control as a means of multilateralizing their coercive policy designed to undermine the regime. So there are 2 actors in this particular configuration who aren't accepting the argument being that this is about your nuclear infractions as opposed to the nature and character of the regime. So having said that, I think if you look at it historically, the United States has managed to negotiate successfully arms control treaties with countries whose abuse of its citizens it tends to censure. They tend to be the whole history of dealing with the Soviet Union on various occasions, particularly in the 1980s, when you began to see a very aggressive advocacy on behalf of dissidents and so forth that were taking place. So I think it's possible for those things to coexist. As was mentioned, there's a set of sanctions that you can introduce that have to do essentially with human rights abuses. More can be done with the UN representative, who's not only not allowed to go into Iran, he's not allowed to go into Turkey, where there's a sort of a sizable number of the Iranian population who tends to live in Turkey, having left Iran. But I do think we have to have some degree of modesty in approaching this issue, because there are some limitations to the ability of the United States and the international community to effectively alter the behavior of the Iranian regime if it has such determinations. You can introduce sanctions regime, and perhaps more should be done. The more should be done about advocacy on behalf of those Iranians who are in prison, because one of the things we see, which is interesting and perhaps paradoxical, is Iranian regime tends to be sensitive to that sort of a rebuke. If you look at in the 1990s, the Europeans invested considerably in essentially the prison systems in Iran. So the Europeans would advocate the penal system on Iran, and so there were some modifications in that. All those things, I think, can coexist with an arms control approach. And I have to say the arms control approach is likely to be predominant. That's just the kind of a reality of the situation. as it represents itself, simply because everybody agrees, and this is an issue they should have to pursue. They have agreed that this is an issue of immediate and imminent danger. I'm not quite sure if it's as much of a crisis that they tend to suggest in terms of timelines. But nevertheless, everybody has been invested into this issue. The other actor that I think people don't really talk about as much, and if you look at the history of the American foreign policy, many of the human rights initiatives tend to originate on Capitol Hill. If you look at this treatment of the Soviet refusnik, the objections of Scoop Jackson to ABM, and so you can see the history of this. It's important to recognize that the Bureau of Human Rights in the State Department was originated under Henry Kissinger's tenure as Secretary of State, an individual that is fair to say had no particular interest in human rights. But he had to concede to that because of the pressure that was coming from the Hill. So a lot of Hill and external groups, I think, can have an impact on this particular issue. The other thing I would say is a point that has been mentioned, but I do think it needs re-emphasis, is an arms control policy or arms control objectives are not going to be imperiled by having a corresponding human rights advocacy campaign. I think that's some of the things that has often, we have sort of convinced ourselves of this, that an arms control approach cannot coexist with a human rights approach because it creates all kinds of problems on the other side. I'm not entirely sure if that thesis is accurate, so I do believe those things can coexist in a more of a strenuous effort. I'll stop there.
I just wanted to follow up maybe with Ray, but also with the other panelists on one point Ray made, which is that that there's a sort of a framework in place for negotiating with Iran, and it tends to limit the dialogue to some extent. The Obama administration, President Obama during the campaign has been open about his desire to try to engage Iran bilaterally. It's often portrayed as kind of a last-ditch effort at diplomacy before you might have to resort to other options. Would a bilateral negotiation, were that to ever come about, give the U.S. an opportunity to engage on human rights issues? I mean, the U.S.'s general policy has been they'd want to keep it very limited to arms control, but is that proper, or would there be an opportunity, a window for the U.S. to engage with Iran on these other issues?
There has always been a sort of a conceptual dissonance, a conceptual dispute. There is a group of, one point of view suggests that the agenda should be kept narrow because otherwise it gives the Iranians the opportunity to divert, to talk about Afghanistan, to talk about Bahrain, to talk about Syria, to talk about this and that. So the agenda has to remain narrow as a means of focusing issue of our principal concern, namely proliferation. That's one school of thought. The second school of thought suggests if the agenda is broader, perhaps you can have some agreements on other issues that would mitigate the disagreements on the nuclear issue. That particular conceptual dissonance, as far as I can tell, has never been resolved. And when an issue remains unresolved, the status quo tends to prevail. So I suspect, given the fact that the issue of a bilateral conversation is introduced as a last-ditch effort, it is likely to remain more focused. Mm-hmm. Should it be considered as a last-ditch effort? I don't think so. We always talk about years of decision, the year of this, the year of that. I think we have more time on this issue. The Iran issue is a paradoxical one. We always think of it as not having enough time, as being urgent, yet somehow there's always more time. So everybody says this is 2008, that's the year 2009, and somehow this issue seems to have within its urgency a degree of time flexibility. I don't know how to explain that. And we have had bilateral discussions before, in October 2009 most directly, when there was a bilateral. I suspect if there's a bilateral conversation, it's likely to take place within the context of 5+1, which tends to condition the agenda that's going to be discussed.
Marina, maybe I'd bring you in on this. Ray said a moment ago we need to have a sense of modesty about what we can really hope to achieve. I'd be interested to hear what your view is on that, and also if you, as we look forward to President Obama's second term, what you would hope for from him and from the United States in terms of the posture they take and the amount of pressure they bring to bear on Iran, and if they did, how much of a difference would it make, purely on human rights as opposed to the economic issues?
Well, I don't think that any Western country can change the behavior of the Iranian regime when it comes to the way it treats political prisoners and dissidents. I think that is the realistic view. But what happens is that, as I told you, when I was in prison, the world was absolutely silent about the fact that there were about, 40,000, I'm not exactly sure what the number was, political prisoners in Iranian prisons, 90% under the age of 20. But what the silence of the world, very practically, on ground zero for us, did for us who were in prison in Iran at the time was that it robbed us from hope. Yes, you cannot change the behavior of the Iranian regime. But what you can do is to give the likes of Nasrin Sotoudeh and 7,000 other political prisoners who are right now in Evin prison, you can give them hope because the news does get into the prison. And if they actually hear that you in the United States of America, and I promise you they will hear this, you're standing up for them and not about this whole masquerade of the whole nuclear thing that almost has become a joke. But if they hear that, you would be literally saving those political prisoners' lives. I have the luxury of not being a politician. I was in a political prison and I saw with my own eyes how thousands of young teenagers were brutally massacred after being tortured and raped under the name of Islam and religion. To be honest with you, all I'm interested in is just saving one life. If I can save one life, then I can die in peace. Now, I know the arguments here are huge, a lot of them are political. But again, for me, it is an issue of practicality, and it is an issue of saving lives.
Ali, you wanted to jump in?
If I can give just one piece of advice to President Obama and the US administration, is doing the exact opposite of my good friend Ray Takeyh has said. Never ever show modesty when you are negotiating with Middle Easterners. The Middle Easterners, after all, we know something about trade, we know something about negotiation. You go to the negotiation with limited expectation and modesty, you lose everything. You have to start here, maybe you end here. This is the attitude you need to have.
I wanted to ask a question about the relationship between a strategy of economic pressure, which the U.S. and the West is pursuing against Iran, and human rights. I guess I'd phrase it this way. The U.S. claims and the P5 claim that the sanctions have, and there's a lot of evidence for it, really devastated the oil exports of Iran and devastated the currency. There's a counter argument that's sometimes made that you end up punishing average Iranians in this process, but nevertheless, there's clearly, for the first time perhaps in a long time, evidence that we do have sanctions that may deserve the phrase crippling to be attached to them. Do you have any evidence, and maybe I'll start with Emanuele's, that this economic pressure is weakening the regime, and does a weaker regime respond by only cracking down harder, or is there some scope for hope that it might actually help the human rights picture in Iran?
There is evidence that the regime has been cracking down harder and harder on broader sectors of the population. So that, to me, is in and of itself evidence that the regime is increasingly on the defensive. They have a problem. They know they have a problem. The way they manage the parliamentary elections is another piece of evidence that they're not going to take the risk of another 2009. I anticipate that with the presidential election next year, you're going to see much of the same. They're just not going to allow millions of people to show up in a free election to see how it goes. They will pilot it. So that's the first point. The second point is that, as it was mentioned before, we have a problem with ordinary Iranians in conveying the message, because we're perhaps still stuck in this notion that truth will eventually spring forth in and of itself. And the Iranian regime is doing a fairly good job in actually advancing its own case in Iran, where of course they have the advantage, but also in the West. And we're not treating them with reciprocity when it comes to their own TV stations and their own their own efforts to advance their own arguments. So we should address head-on with a lot more resources, with better public diplomacy, the arguments that the regime is making that sanctions are causing a humanitarian catastrophe for ordinary Iranians, and the attempt by the regime to suggest that our policy will increasingly look like the Iraq sanctions policy, which harmed hundreds of thousands of ordinary Iraqis. That's the second point. The third point is that we have to fine-tune our sanctions policy to increasingly go after the people inside of the regime or who are in the proximity of the regime that are greatly benefiting from the skewed balance of the economy in the current situation. And I just want to give one example of one of the many, many things that could be done. There is one thing that we all understand in this room, I believe, which is corporate responsibility. When there is corporate malfeasance, it's not just the company that gets fined or the bank, but it's also its senior management, the people who were actually personally responsible for the bad decisions. We have sanctioned hundreds of Iranian companies, but most of the CEOs and the senior managers of those companies, who are oftentimes, because we identified the link, members or former members of the Revolutionary Guards. The companies are linked to the Revolutionary Guard. The senior management is part of the Revolutionary Guard. The CEOs are former government officials and former Revolutionary Guards. And they are not sanctioned, free to travel, and free to have bank accounts in Malaysia, in Switzerland, and in all the places where they're still able to move about. We should go after them as well and make it known to the Iranians that our sanctions are going not after ordinary people, but after the regime.
I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. I think we have about 25 minutes left. And please, when I call on you, identify yourself and address the question, if you can, to one of the members of the panel. This gentleman here in the third row.
My name is Joel Sprayregan. I address this to any of you who spoke about the P5+1. If any of you have studied closely the persona of Baroness Ashton, who's leading that, it would be hard to find a person anywhere in the world more unsuited to successfully lead this kind of negotiation. How can you attach any seriousness to a negotiation headed by her? I'm not going to go into detail here as to why I'm saying this, but anyone who studied her understands it.
Which wants to take a crack at it, Ray?
I mentioned P5. I mean, that's just the structure that has evolved to deal with this particular issue, and the European Foreign Minister of the European Union, previously was Mr. Solano, takes that position as representing the European Union, which is one of the actors in this. The United States and other countries are represented ordinarily by political directors. They don't have to be, but that's just the way this issue evolved. So some of these structures are just continuities. They have evolved and they just persist. Now, who comes into that and the personalities that come to that are the function of those particular organizations. In this particular case, it's the European Union. I think we tend to focus a great deal on who's on the other side of the table, the British representative or the American representative. The problem with the P5-1 is who's on the other side of the table. It's not so much. I mean, these negotiations are stalemated, not because Lady Ashton, but because Saeed Jalili. I mean, that's basically the reason why that's happened, because of his limitations and because of the approach that they have had to these particular issues. So I think the stalemate in these conversations should really be directed toward the other side of the table.
This lady down here in the front. Do you want to wait for the microphone?
My name is Wendy Child, and this question is for Marina. How did you gain your freedom?
Well, it's a very long story, and I have written 2 books about it. So, Prisoner of Tehran and After Tehran. So I'm afraid it's not going to fit here, but I was in prison for 2 years, 2 months, 12 days. And during that time, I was tortured. I came close to execution. I was raped. I was forced to marry one of my interrogators, who was a member of the Revolutionary Guard. And he threatened me that if I didn't, he would arrest my mom and dad. So I did that to protect my family. Now, I am a Christian. I'm from a Christian family. He forced me to convert to Islam as well. So One day I looked around me, I had lost my freedom, my family, my name, my religion, my dignity, everything was lost. And I found out that this man that I was forced to marry, he actually used to be a political prisoner in Evin prison during the time of the Shah. And when the tables turned, he became an interrogator and then torturer within the system. You know, that old cycle that turns the victim into the torturer and torturer into the victim. But actually, after he was assassinated, 15 months after our marriage, his family, who were very good people actually, they intervened and they bribed every government official. And they got me out of jail. But then for 6 years, the government of Iran wouldn't give me a passport. But then there was some help from my church and other places, and you know, bribes were paid. And I had to pay a huge sum of money to the Iranian government, and I have a receipt for it. I'm going to claim it with interest, hopefully one day. And then after that, interestingly enough, talking about how to help Iranians, so I got the passport, right? So I have the passport in my hand. I have a 2-year-old child. I married my boyfriend, who was the organist at my church, in the Catholic Church in Tehran. And now we want to exit Iran, and no country would give us a visa because they knew that we were going to claim refugee status as soon as we land anywhere. And it came down to my church, and they knew the Spanish ambassador. So the Spanish ambassador gave us a visa only if we didn't claim refugee status from Spain. So imagine, we got to Spain really not quite sure where to go. And luckily enough, my husband had family in Hungary. But I mean, yes, there are these Iranian officials that have tons of money, and they find homes in the West. Why? Because they bring their money with them. But then the dissidents that come with the clothes on their back, like honestly, when we landed in Canada, we had $200 left into our pockets. We were literally hungry, and no country was taking us. Finally, Canada did. And I'm so grateful to this great country up north that gave us a home where we had nowhere to be. Just one thing, it's a little bit out of that, but I just need to make a point. Are we going to get time at the end?
Yeah, I'll give you some time, sure.
Okay, great,
Sure.
because there's
Happy to.
something I really need to mention.
Yeah, okay. The gentleman in the back row.
Good morning. Thank you. Ken Timmerman. I'm the president and CEO of the Foundation for Democracy in Iran, Iran.org. So we've been working with people who are former political prisoners and with the pro-freedom movement in Iran. I think, as some of you have mentioned, it's pretty clear that President Obama is going to cut a deal, or is going to try to cut a deal with the Iranian regime over their nuclear weapons program that will, in fact, sacrifice the people of Iran. So I'd like to ask Ali if you could kind of add to some of those very good suggestions that Emanuele made earlier on how we can tie together the U.S. national security interest and the human rights agenda, because I happen to believe that the best investment that we can make in U.S. national security is to help the people of Iran get rid of the regime.
Thank you for the question. Well, you see, the United States has actually fairly good experiences in this regard. Many people in this group assembled here today belong to the right age group. You remember, some of you, the bad old days of the Cold War, but you also remember how the United States managed to start a Helsinki process with the Soviet Union. So the idea was that negotiations between the United States and the Soviet regime should not only be about disarmament, a human rights component should be built into the negotiations. That, of course, hugely encouraged dissidents in the Soviet society who felt that there was international support for them. And they knew that there was a government outside of their own totalitarian system trying to give them a voice. That was very, very important. Another very important fact was that you had very, very good strategists who managed to organize some of the people who had left the Soviet system and became opponents of it. You gave a voice to the opposition movement here in the US, and you also managed to wage a cultural warfare against totalitarianism. Your systems, not only the intelligence services, but also the university systems, the academics, they managed to mobilize the opinion of the people in the world against the Soviet regime. today, I don't see that. Let me tell you what frustrates me as an Iranian. I see American academics waging war and demanding closure of Guantanamo base for years and years and years, but none of these do-gooders talks about human rights in Iran. Why? Where are these good people, who talk about closure of Guantanamo when it comes to Iran? Those good people who talk about human rights in secular autocratic regimes in the Middle East have totally forgotten Iran. I have an idea of why they do this, because I believe that many of them fundamentally are communists. Yes, they are communists. They still are. Even after the end of the Cold War, they are communists. So they always side with the enemies of the United States. They believe that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So if the Islamic Republic of Iran is critical towards the United States, then the Islamic Republic of Iran is a friend of me teaching at Berkeley, just to mention one of the liberal institutions. And that is such a shame.
How did you come up with that?
Pure accident. That is such a shame. But use your experiences from the years of the Cold War. Try to engage some of the people who served the United States government during the Cold War, some of those people who know how to wage cultural warfare. Not only those people who managed to make Dr. Zhivago, the novel, into a movie. Why don't we have an Iranian Dr. Zhivago? This is how you can mobilize the world opinion against those who are not only your enemies and opponents, but also the enemies and opponents of the vast majority of Iranians.
Thanks, Ali. I wish we had a Berkeley professor to call on now. But this gentleman over here.
Thank you, and thanks to the panel. John Hanna from FDD. I think this might be addressed to Ray, although I'd be interested in what some of the folks from the more human rights perspective might think about this. But just a historical footnote, Ray, the year of decision, I don't know if you remember, I think I was the first U.S. official ever associated with this back in 2007 when I had a discussion with a European diplomat, and I actually used the phrase that with respect to Iran, this was a year of decision for the United States, and he immediately ran off in great alarm to the Washington Post, and it showed up in the newspaper that weekend. He thought we were about to launch a bombing operation. I actually meant a year of decision for the Bush administration on whether it was going to actually deal seriously with Iran or whether it was going to have to kick the can down the road for a variety of reasons. My question goes back to the tension between the nuclear deal and human rights. And just, a hypothetical, if we do reach a point where the rubber meets the road and through some combination of sanctions and Iranian fear and concerns for the survival of the regime, they do come forward and we're able to get some kind of credible deal. But the Iranians then insist that they've got to repeat something like what happened in the Algiers Accord back in 1980 when we got the hostages out. And I think one of the first one or two provisions in the Algiers Accord is basically an American commitment of non-interference in Iranian internal affairs. If, in fact, that deal is on the table and it requires President Obama to make that kind of concession, at least verbally, whatever we do after that. My own sense, I think I agree with Ken Timmerman, is that the president goes for that, and everything, at least before 2009, suggests he was perfectly ready. Maybe he even thought the key to getting a nuclear deal was to go out of his way publicly to assure the Iranian regime and the Islamic Republic of Iran that, in fact, we had no business interfering. We're fine with the status quo, and they're continuing in existence in perpetuity. So just your thoughts on that, and then perhaps one of your colleagues commenting on their perspective as an Iranian, what they think the kind of impact of that U.S. concession would be.
So I have to start out by saying I actually attended Berkeley.
So you're suspect right off the bat.
That may explain a lot. I think one of the challenges that the international community will have, the 5+1 and the United States, is if there is some sort of a nuclear deal, and the nuclear deal is, I mean, as you know, it's not the minute the nuclear deal is signed, a new phase of an arms control problem emerges. It's called compliance. So there's a whole question of whether the treaty is going to be, or the agreement is going to be signed. But how do you sustain pressure on other aspects of Iranian misbehavior in light of the nuclear deal? And human rights is one, and I'm going to come back to it. But today, the Islamic Republic actually stands convicted, no longer accused, but convicted of terrorism on the American homeland, with the conviction of the plot to assassinate the Saudi emissary at the first entity to do so since Al-Qaeda, target the American homeland and so on. My guess is, my hope would be that the United States, particularly in the context of today's Middle East, cannot discuss these issues with the Iranians purely as a technical agreement or disagreement on nuclear program. The way the countries treat their citizens, excuse me, the way the countries of the Middle East treat their citizens has now, I think, entered the norm of the American conception of the Middle East. That had not been the case in many times before. The case in terms of intervention in Libya, prospective intervention in Syria, or a greater degree of support for Syria. Suddenly, the right to protect and how citizens are treated by their regimes has entered the political calculation of Western countries, the United States, about the Middle East. That had not been there before. And I would suspect, and I would guess that we will continue that advocacy, and should continue that advocacy, continue sanctions regimes that are targeted on human rights, and terrorism, and subversion, about how Iran treats its neighbors, how Iranians treat their citizens. All those issues have to be considered. I think it'd be difficult to do that in terms of the international coalition, which I think is going to go away, the commerce comes back and so on. But that would be the challenge of a post-arms control treaty for any American administration.
I don't mean to bring this to an abrupt close, but we're really running out of time, and Marina had asked for a little bit of time at the end. Marina, we literally have about 2 minutes left, so but I give the floor to you to say
That will
what you'd
do.
like to say.
Thank you. Now, talking about what should be done about Iran, I just need to mention this because it's really been bothering me. And I know you might know that an Iranian organization, a dissident organization, it's called the Mujahideen Khalq Organization of Iran, was taken off the terrorist list in the US not long time ago. Now, during my travels, I have run into many US politicians that support this decision, and I am absolutely against it. Mujahideen Khalq Organization, let's, take it apart. The word mujahid, it comes from the word jihad. And this organization was created in Iran in the 60s in the University of Tehran, and it is a Marxist Islamist organization, and it assassinated many Shah government officials and even foreigners that worked in Iran. And then during the revolution, it supported Ayatollah Khomeini, but then after the revolution, they thought they can outsmart Ayatollah Khomeini and his people, and they couldn't, and as a result, many of them ended up in Evin prison. Of course, the leaders, they escaped, and then they sided with Saddam Hussein during the war between Iran and Iraq, and they attacked Iran, and of course, the Revolutionary Guard massacred them. And then as a result, their supporters in Evin prison, many of them my friends, teenagers, they were massacred in 1988. Now, when I have spoken with some US politicians, they have told me, well, the Mujahideen really haven't killed anybody in the past 10 years. And my response to that is, so you're telling me that if I come and kill your father, then after 10 years, I don't kill anybody, I come back to you and say, you know what, I'm so sorry I killed your dad, but you know what, I'm just gonna walk free because it's been 10 years and I haven't killed anybody. So again, please think about these complicated issues. The enemy of your enemy is not necessarily your friend. Even if, let's imagine that the government in Iran falls, whatever way, violence, no violence, what is going to take its place? this is the problem of U.S. foreign policy. It's all about getting rid of so and so and so. Same thing happened in Afghanistan, same thing happened in Iran. Let's get rid of this or that person or this or that system. But unfortunately, there's never any thought put into what is going to come after. So if we get rid of the government in Iran, let's say, and we support the Mujahideen Khalq organization that are a jihadist organization, and let's just imagine that. Then do you think in the long run it's even going to get any better? So it's all about thinking a little bit ahead and not only seeing the front of our noses. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Marina. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Emanuele. It was a very thought-provoking discussion. It's clear we could have kept going, but we are honored now to have Ambassador Robert Ford, the U.S. Ambassador to Syria, join us to deliver keynote remarks. So at this point, I'd like to invite Andy Lappin to the stage to introduce Ambassador Ford, and thank you all very much, and thanks again to the panelists.